panelists on before they speak. So thank you everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Excuse me. Before we start, just a few webinar housekeeping pieces here. So just a reminder that your audio and video are disabled automatically, so don't worry if you cough or comment, we won't hear you, but due to the high numbers that makes it easier for our speakers. However, we do want to hear from you, we want to hear your questions, so we would ask you to post questions using the Q&A function at any time, and you can find that at the bottom of your screen. So please do let us have your questions, because the last 30 minutes of today's webinar will be a discussion, so we'd love to hear from you. Just a reminder that this session is being recorded. Closed captioning is also available in English. You can turn that on at the bottom of your screen. And again, just a reminder that the recording and presentations will be shared on the INEE website and circulated afterwards. So please do look out for those and share them with your colleagues. But let's get started with today's webinar. If we could go to the next slide, Hannah. So the focus today is very much on using the INEE Minimum Standards during the COVID-19 response. This is part of a series of webinars we're doing here at INEE to support education and emergencies colleagues in these complex times during COVID-19. You can find the resource collection on COVID-19 on the INEE website, along with recordings of our previous webinars covering topics such as things like distance learning, PSS and SEL, and teacher support, as well as other resources and useful tools there, so do take a look. But the minimum standards are central to our work here at INEE and to you in the sector, so we thought it was really important to take some time to really think about how we are using them currently. And I'm excited today that will we have two sort of strands to this webinar. The first will really be an orientation of a resource that was recently launched here at INEE, which is a technical note to support AIE colleagues during COVID-19. So we'll have an orientation to that new resource. And then we'll also hear some really practical examples of how colleagues are using the minimum standards more broadly and that technical note specifically in their work. So we're really looking forward to that today. Before I go into the agenda, however, and before we get started officially, we do just have a quick poll for you. We're keen to learn more about how colleagues are approaching the COVID-19 response and how we at INEE can provide more support. So we're going to put a quick poll up and just ask you just to spend a couple of minutes responding to these questions. There are 3 questions for you there, so just a couple of minutes to respond. So you can select your answers on the poll on your screen. We'll just leave it open for a couple of minutes. Great, just a few more seconds. Thanks everyone, this is really helpful for us here at INEE. Great. Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much, everyone. We'll use that to inform our discussion today, but also to help our planning here at INEE. Wonderful. Okay, so before I introduce our wonderful speakers, I'm going to hand you over to my director, Dean Brooks, to formally welcome you to today's webinar. Thank you, Dean.
Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you, everybody, for taking time to join today's webinar. As you know, INEE is an open global network working hard to ensure the right to education in emergencies, the right to an education characterized by quality and safety. That's what today is also working to address. And as you also should know, or probably know, the minimum standards created by over 3,500 experts around the world, first launched in 2004, really not only were prioritized by the membership of INEE, but really represent the guidance and the principles in responding, and also in the midst of a pandemic like we've faced today. So that's why this guidance and technical note was put together to support you in your work. We really hope that you're using this, and if you have questions, that you'll reach out to us. Today's webinar, as Charlotte explained, really has been organized not only to give you a help you become familiar with the technical note, but also to hear from technical experts who are using it, and how it is actually informing their work. I wish you all well, and I thank you again for taking time to join us today, and I'm happy to hand over now to Charlotte. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Dean. So I'm conscious of time, so let's get started with today's agenda. So if we go to the next slide, Hannah, just to let everyone know the approach today. So we'll begin really looking at the technical note that Dean mentioned and really sort of launching that officially. So my colleague Natalie Brackett here at INEE will give a brief overview of the minimum standards, although it's great to see that many of you are already very familiar. And then Jen Steele, who actually led the development of the technical note, will kindly provide an orientation to that. So thank you both. We'll then hand over to a series of presentations looking at how the minimum standards are being used in the COVID-19 response currently. So we'll hear from Therese Karan at NRC around how they're being used in the Syria response there. We'll hear from Yul Alea about how the Ministry of Education are using these, so thinking about a policy level in his work at Mindanao. And then we'll hear from Marco Grazia from World Vision around how he's been using the standards in their global response at World Vision. And then we'll last but not least hear from my other colleague at INEE, Bente Sandel-Hassan, who will provide some reflections on the sort of that importance of the standards during COVID-19 with some practical examples. And then we'll hopefully have time for a good discussion altogether for about 30 minutes. But I don't want to take up too much time, so I'll hand over straight away to Natalie for that. So the quick overview of the standards. Thank you so much, Natalie, and thanks again to our panelists and participants for joining us today in these complicated and busy times.
Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you, Dean. And thank you all the participants today. As you can tell, we're really eager to have your insights and to hear about how you're using the minimum standards in your work. Certainly our effort to produce this technical note is our vehicle for getting the minimum standards into your hands during this response. I know that we internally at INEE have found the standards incredibly useful for organizing our resource collection and all of the great things that we're sharing with you via the website and via this webinar series. So really just to emphasize before an incredibly brief introduction to the standards, I assure you, reach out to us anytime if you're interested in the 1-day, 3-day, or 5-day training version of this. But the point to emphasize here is really what Dean said about the power of this network and kind of the origin of that power coming from the effort of our members to produce the minimum standards themselves. This is our foundational tool for INEE, and we really do believe that it is the foundational tool for ensuring quality in education emergencies overall. Thanks, Hannah, so much for queuing up my slide. You'll see the actual statistics there behind what I'm claiming. The fact that we've had thousands of educators and practitioners feed into this and create this document together through a consultative process from over 52 countries. Certainly some of the rights-based text that you see here, in the 20 years since the minimum standards have been in use, our field has come a very long way. There's many more to add to the list now about the foundations of the right to education that all children, all learners have. I will say as well, the text of the INEE minimum standards, the process that was engaged to create these in 2004 and then to update them in 2010, This is very much inspired by the SPHERE standards, by our other technical standards in the humanitarian sectors, thinking of the child protection minimum standards here as one our EIE practitioners might be particularly familiar with. So in both process and content, INEE minimum standards sit among a set of peers that you can draw from for quality support across sectors. My point again today is just that these are a starting point. They're aspirational in many ways. Frequently when I speak with folks at trainings, even in some settings that are maybe less traditional EIE, maybe in very well-resourced places, folks will voice their concern that we will never hit every one of these minimum standards. How can we possibly achieve the level of quality that is outlined here? To that I say, this is for us to hold ourselves accountable to. And I think especially during an acute emergency that we are experiencing at such a scale that we never have before. And this is a really useful document to unite us and to keep us hopeful and inspired towards achieving quality education for all. Hannah, could you click me on to the next slide? Thanks so much. Again, very briefly, just looking at the content of the standards themselves. It's a little blurry here, sorry about that. But I do want to flash some of the terminology for those that are not super familiar. The standards themselves are organized into 5 different domains. The first domain are the foundational standards. These are meant to support and uplift each of the standards across the other domains. They're kind of considered continuous for consideration throughout the rest of the, I believe it's 19 standards overall. The other 4 domains are access and learning environment, teaching and learning, teachers and other education personnel, and education policy. You'll also see some key thematic issues highlighted, and again, these are kind of interspersed topics that you'll find throughout the minimum standards text. If you were familiar with the way this is outlined, with this framework overall, it really is such a key to unlocking a lot of the way that things are done in the EIE world. I have to say, since I've been in this role for the last 3 years, I myself have become more and more maybe indoctrinated is the word. Venta Sandal-Asen, my colleague you'll hear from later, refers to this as almost a religious text. It really is very guiding for the way you think about program design, program implementation, assessment and evaluation, advocacy, policy. There are many uses to the standards that once you're familiar with this terminology and the kind of categories, domains especially, you'll find yourself understanding more and more some of the other global guidance that is out there, since this is so foundational to what many agencies do. I will not harp too much on that. Hannah, we can click on to the next slide. I just want to briefly say that the standards themselves are available in, I believe it's 22 languages now. We know that they have been implemented and used in over 110 countries, and that's some old data. That's from 2012, so you can only imagine the global use of the minimum standards at this point. And finally, Hannah, we can click on to the next one. The standards have also been contextualized to 13 different countries. Because the minimum standards are a global, universal tool, there can be challenges to implementation. And again, that kind of tension between the standard that we're articulating, the quality that we would like to achieve, and how to go about that in a particular context. The process is a rather formal and heavy one. It does entail kind of in-person consultations and workshops in the same way that the minimum standards themselves were developed. But the intent here, I think overall, with making you aware of contextualization, is to say that these are not a dominant or exclusive framework. In fact, in past contextualization processes, other strategies, frameworks, policies that are already in place are actively included. And again, the minimum standards are considered maybe a basis for further in-depth work. I do want to encourage you to think of INEE's other tools that are based on the minimum standards, our conflict-sensitive education materials, our teacher training materials, our psychosocial support and social emotional learning materials. Again, having a knowledge of the minimum standards will really make a lot of the other guidance much more legible and actively usable for you. That's where I will stop for now. I would like to turn over to Jen to introduce one of those exciting new tools that is based off of the minimum standards and that does speak specifically to this COVID-19 response. And just a huge thanks to her for her help developing this.
Thank you, Natalie. So greetings to everyone. The document, the technical note, is very importantly a living document. As we have discussed, we are in an unprecedented crisis, and so it will be important for the note and the resources that it links to be updated as the crisis evolves. It'll be important for us to learn together and contribute that learning to the updating of the notes, and of course to contributing resources that go on the COVID-19 resource collection. The document has been designed to essentially be a portal to the COVID-19 resource collection, where you will find sometimes even daily updates on subsector and context-specific resources. The technical note is designed to be relevant now, which for most of us, because we are primarily in the acute stage, will be the response phase. With the periodic updating, will ensure that the technical note is responsive to the various phases of the crisis. For a majority of us, we'll see a somewhat linear process moving towards recovery and preparedness. But again, because we are in an unprecedented crisis, we can't presume that the process will be linear. And of course, that across different contexts, you'll see different needs. So the minimum standards are very clearly the frame. So all of the domains and most of the standards were identified as being appropriate for this phase of the response. It has been designed using current WHO guidelines around prevention of COVID-19, including physical distancing and hygiene practices. It is a fairly concise 20-page document. And within those pages, we try to strike a series of balances. So between being accessible for people who don't necessarily know the minimum standards very well, as well as those who are fairly well versed in it. As Natalie has mentioned, the idea is to provide guidance, but to not be prescriptive and to leave space for the necessary contextualization. With the examples that we have ahead from our colleagues in the field, you'll see how Therese, for example, in the Syria context, has identified 4 of the 19 minimum standards that are most appropriate right now. Yul will talk a bit about which distance learning methods are most feasible in Mindanao and in that context right now. And Mario will talk a little bit about how some of the context in which World Vision works vary in terms of their operational aspects and changing scenarios, and then how the guidance is appropriate for those different contexts. We also tried to strike a balance between providing links to helpful resources without being a link-heavy document that might feel overwhelming. And so what we've done is identified some really specific tasks and specific tools that we think are likely relevant for most everyone, and then let the COVID-19 resource collection play the role of having those specific context relevant tools. We've mentioned that this is for the acute phase of the humanitarian project cycle, so there is a fairly heavy focus on needs assessment and analysis and strategic response planning, but it doesn't mean that we don't mention planning for monitoring. It is designed for environments that were fragile or crisis affected before COVID-19, and it assumes that the majority of learners are outside of schools because we have documentation about how high those numbers are. Hannah, if you can move to the next slide, please. So the document has 5 key messages or steps that we suggest be considered. They are presented linearly, but we want to confirm that each context is specific. Some actions are necessary to continue throughout your activities, and importantly, for example, taking care of yourself and coordinating your work. Others really do require sequencing, such as developing your activity plan based on an analysis of the context and collected evidence from there. So within each of these 5 main steps, we have actions, and we have a total of 11 key actions we suggest you consider. Within each of those 11 actions, we have a total of 23 suggested tasks. And as I noted, each task is tied to a domain and at least one relevant minimum standard. As Natalie has mentioned, the foundational standards, as they run through all of the guidance in the minimum standards, the foundational standards run through each of the tasks that we have identified here. So I will give a few examples of the types of actions and resources that we provide within each of these 5 steps. So step 1, very purposefully, is take care of yourself. We have, as an example of a resource, a link to the INEE Practitioner Wellbeing webinar, where you will find some very specific tasks, some practical steps for promoting well-being. Step 2, again, very foundational as it is in the minimum standards, to coordinate your work. We would hope that as response planning is commencing, that coordination related calls or emails will be one of the first steps that you take, and of course that continues to promote shared energies and actions and prevent duplication. We note that what coordination looks like in your context and different contexts might be very different from others. So it might be a formal cluster that has been in place for some time if you're in a protracted crisis, or it might be an informal working group that is developing for the purpose of response to COVID-19. So step 3, analyze the context, is where you can expect to see quite a few of the proposed actions. So actions 3 through 4 help with the development of the assessment steps. We provide a link to a number of global education cluster tools that have been modified for COVID-19. As an example, there are links to assessment protocol and tools for that effort, which links to the foundational standards, the standard of analysis, and the focus area of assessment. Actions 5 through 8 focus primarily on each of the remaining 4 minimum standards. So we look at specific considerations for actions that relate to, for example, Domain 2, access and learning environments, Standard 2, protection and well-being. We provide some specific considerations for promoting equity and inclusion. We talk about the different modalities for distance learning, which would relate to, again, Domain 2, access and learning environment, Standard 1, equal access, and Standard 3, facilities and services. Once we get to step 4, this is the development of the activity plan. Action 9, as an example, we link to the Global Education Cluster's COVID-19 response and recovery strategy template. We have action 10, which is around intercluster coordination and ensuring cross-sectoral strategies, where we've shared some basic ideas pulled in part from the Ebola response and learning and best practices from that. Step 5 is reviewing progress and quality. So we have provided action 11, which is around preparing a monitoring framework for the interventions you propose. We've provided links to standardized indicators and made recommendations around disaggregating data, ensuring gender and disability sensitivity. Next slide, please, Hannah. So on this slide, I provide a snapshot of what most of the document looks like. You'll see that it is the third step, which is to analyze the context. You have the visual of where you are in the proposed process of the steps. This is action 4 of 11 actions that we have recommended, and it is suggested task 4 of 23. So if we look in the header of the table, we see that the action is to plan and undertake what we propose to be a joint needs assessment, hopefully in coordination with other sectors and actors. The suggested task is to be familiar with or become familiar with the Global Education Cluster's guide for needs assessments and analysis. And we provide as well a link to specific indicators and questions to consider when undertaking a COVID-19 assessment. We briefly identify the risk that the action mitigates, which in this case is ensuring coordination and ensuring data is used to prepare the activity plan. As noted, we have the relevant INEE minimum standard or standards. And then one element that makes this really a living document, as I mentioned earlier, is the link to the INEE coordination collection, where you will see updated documents and also those existing tested documents that can support with effective coordination. In the note box, not every action has a note, but where we think there's something really quite relevant to the context that we want to, or to the crisis that we want to highlight, we have pulled that out into a note box. So you will see one for distance learning, for example, because we know that that is a critical area of interest and concern for practitioners. So with this note, because we're talking about undertaking an assessment, we flag that the types of data collection or assessment practices that you might be familiar with or that might be responsive to certain sociocultural norms, such as in-person meetings, may not be feasible or are unlikely to be feasible in this context. And so a note there to be very thoughtful about how to collect data in ways that many of us have not done before. So we hope that this is an accessible structure that strikes a balance between providing broader suggestions and providing links to specific tools to support contextualization of these efforts. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jen and Natalie. Thanks to both of you for the presentations, but also all of the work that went into this. And I can see that my colleague Sarah has shared the document in the chat, and we do hope that this proves useful to your work. And as they both said, this is a living document, and here at INEE we're very much committed to supporting these efforts as much as we can moving forward. So look forward to being in touch as this work evolves. But thank you. I can see from the questions that we do have some keen to hear already if there's some practical examples of what this is looking like in different contexts. So let's change track now to hear from a great range of colleagues working in very different contexts. I'm going to begin by handing over to Therese Karan from NRC, and Hannah, if you can perhaps tee up the next slide, who's going to share the work she's been doing with the COVID-19 response, the Syria response. So thank you so very much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Charlotte, and good afternoon, everybody. Here in Amman, it's afternoon and the sun is shining, so very good to be able to join you. Basically, we have a very quick 5 minutes, so I'm just going to give you a very quick overview of what we're doing and then relate that to the standards that we are trying to reflect from INEE Minimum Standards in our response. For our NRC Syria Response Office response, we have 3 different phases that we're operating in. The first one being an emergency phase, which is the current phase. So we have a number of different distance learning activities that we are using at the moment. We have CHEP and YEP learning at home packages. For children, we have what we use across the country, the self-learning program. For youth, we have other modules, distance learning modules that are focused on life skills and also work readiness skills for post-COVID response. And a very important element of all of this is our follow-up support, whether it's visits, which are still possible using social distancing, but we expect in the very near future that those two will stop, but also messaging and phone calls. The second phase being preparedness phase. One of the things that we are very focused at the moment, of course, on implementing in trying to respond, trying to keep children connected with their learning, but we're also at the same time with teams trying to look at how do we get ready for the next phase. So when the next phase happens, none of us know. Some of us predict that it might be for the school year in September, but it might go longer. Let's see what happens in our particular context. But we are starting to prepare and think about preparing, because when we have only essential services available, all other shops and locations closed, then we really have to think ahead to get ready for what we consider to be the final stage of some sort of new normal. So in our preparedness phase, at the same time as our emergency phase, we're trying to do procurement, pre-positioning materials, thinking about hygiene when we do eventually return to centres, schools and other sites, looking at hand washing stations, signage, etc. And looking at community awareness for parents, youth, children and authorities to help them to prepare as well for going back to learning modalities that were used in the past. And then finally, we also have been thinking a lot about what's our new normal. A lot of people talk about at the moment, particularly in social media, we're going to go back to normal, but actually, will we ever get back to normal? That's an interesting question when it comes to learning. And also we've learnt a lot from this process, and some of it has been very positive, whilst at the same time very challenging. So with our three-phase response, our objective is a very simple one, or we have three simple objectives. First of all, we're trying to keep children connected. So whilst we're using distance learning and it's all paper-based, materials that get distributed and are handed out to children, what we're aiming to do is keeping children connected with the learning process. We're also hoping that by having them learn at home, and in some cases for us, learning at home means either in a home where they are displaced, in a temporary location, in an informal tented settlement or in a tented settlement. We want children to be able to learn safely at home. And finally, we want them to actually remain learning. And one of the messages that we've been speaking a lot about in our team is about we're not trying to actually replace the education system at the moment, but what we are trying to do is maintain the habit of learning, trying to make sure that children don't lose that habit, that they don't lose the joy that they felt from learning, and trying to make sure that they still feel that joy and that they will be excited when school goes back eventually, not only to connect with friends and their school community, but to reconnect again with learning in a very different environment. If you can change to the next slide, thank you. So in our context, just to highlight a couple of things. First of all, we are in a very low resource environment. Yes, we may have decent funding and we're very fortunate to be supported by many good donors. However, most of the families that we're operating with have limited or no access to internet, don't have phones. We did a survey before the response started. We had 35% of parents had a phone, and in many cases do not always have electricity or access to electricity. So the type of response that we had to design was very much reflective of those sorts of conditions. When we reflected as a team on what we thought were the main minimum standards that we were focusing on at the moment, these were the standards that we identified. There could be many more that we could think about, but these particular ones. We've really been focused on access and learning environment, standard 1, trying to make sure that all children have access to learning. This is nothing new, we always do this, but one of the exciting opportunities that has come from learning at home has been we've had a lot more parents ask us about children with disabilities. We're really excited because we've been able to reach out to them, and we're looking forward that when our centres reopen, that hopefully we will also be able to welcome these children back to our centres. Something we've always tried to do, but because we're visiting tents, tent by tent or house by house, we're having the opportunity to meet children with their families, of course, using all social distancing procedures. The second one is related to access and learning environment. Standard 2, protection and well-being. At this time, as in all of our responses, well-being is really, really important. And so one of the things that has been key in all of the inputs that we're using with our children and our youth in their programs, not only have we got the learning process, not only have we got hygiene messages and health messages, but very importantly, PSS messaging. It's very focused on well-being not only of the child or the youth, but also of their wider family members. Third, we have the teaching and learning standard, standard number 2. We have training, professional development and support. For us, we probably focus at this stage very much on support. How do we support our facilitators in this very new environment where very often we can no longer see them face to face? We're dealing with them over the telephone. We're sending them messages in written form, using whatever modality we can to communicate with them, trying to make sure that they don't feel that they are alone, that we are with them in this process. And we hope in the next few weeks, when things become a little bit more regular with this new modality of distance learning, that we'll be able to add step by step as they feel more ready to cope, a little bit of professional development and training as well, based on what they identify as the needs that they have at the moment and the gaps. And finally, the final standard is standard 3 of analysis. And this is the one that's been perhaps the most debated, interesting, and fun to discuss with our teams, is basically how do we monitor what we're doing? How do we show, how do we collect the evidence to show what we're doing and what we're learning from it? So it's not so much focused on the actual measurement of child learning or youth learning, but more importantly, not only that, but also what are we doing? How often do our facilitators go to visit? How often are they connecting? How often are they providing feedback in distance learning module booklets to the child or to the family or to the youth? And how often do youth and children provide feedback and responses to us? And part of this as well has been the rolling out of something we've been working on as an office for quite some time, and that is our feedback handling mechanism and what is the role that that mechanism plays. So once again, 3 main objectives. We want our children and youth to feel connected, to keep connected with the learning process. We want them to be protected by learning at home. And most importantly, we want them to be learning, to have and keep and maintain and get excited by learning being a part of everyday life, learning being something that they continue to do, and hopefully something that continues to bring them joy. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Rose. I think really powerful practical examples for us there that I think will ring true for many of us in our work. So thank you so much for that. And I'm conscious that many of our participants and our members have been asking for examples from sort of really low resource settings with these limited access to devices and to internet and so on. So again, really appreciate you sharing from this context all the work that you and your teams have been doing. Thank you. We're now going to shift to a very different context and to hear more of sort of the policy level application of the minimum standards and the technical guidance notes. So I'm very grateful that Yul Alea, hope I'm saying that right, you're from Mindanao in the Philippines, has been able to join us to share some of the work he has been doing with the ministry there. Yul's connectivity might not be great, so he may keep his video off for now, but hopefully the audio will work well. Thank you so much for joining us, Yul. Over to you.
Is my audio okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much indeed. For me, it's really a great blessing that we are all here to work together to combat this COVID-19 pandemic. What I'd like to present to you is we at the ministry is looking at public education service delivery. So our main concern is how do we get more than almost 3,000 schools, public schools, continue to deliver education services to almost 1 million learners in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. So the technical note came to me very, very timely because it was also during that time, I think it was last week, 2 weeks ago, that I was trying to map out some of the strategies that we need to take in the ministry. So I'm very thankful for the technical note that it presented. It comes as a supplemental material to the MSCE actually, and especially tailored for the COVID-19 response. The technical note, while it's very helpful for us as practitioners of education and emergency practitioners, it also helped me imagine what will be our appropriate response to the teachers in the field, to the concerns of teachers in the field, to the school leaders, to parents. So, for example, at the moment, teachers will have these kind of questions. How do we continue education? When do we open our classes? How can enrollment be done given social distancing and community quarantine? What do we need to prepare in our schools to make the environment COVID-19 safe? How will school schedules look like if learners will attend school on shifting basis? How can learning continue when learners are at home? How will teachers do teaching in this challenging context? What will the learners learn and teachers teach in this context? What are the doable learning delivery modalities? How do we measure learning outcomes in the current context? And what support and how can support be provided to teachers? So these are the questions that we think are on top of the head of many teachers at the moment. This is, as we said, this is not the normal situation, but this may be the new normal. So the question now is, how do we do an adaptive teaching and learning strategies? Now, in our context, we actually only have we only have 5% connectivity to the internet, 5%. So this means that we cannot really do online learning. We cannot rely on online learning. In short, we are in a no-tech environment. So which adds to our challenge. How do we do teaching and learning given the stay-at-home policy and social distancing and community quarantine measures? So if we don't have the technology, how do we do this? How do we do an adaptive teaching and learning? So if can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so this is our context, and can we just proceed to the next slide? I'd like to highlight that more. So these are our 3 goals. Number 1, our primary goal really is to ensure that our personnel and learners are healthy, safe, and protected. That's number 1. Number 2, we need to be able to establish learning environments for learning continuity. Number 3, we need to ensure that education service delivery continues. So to do this, how will this look like? How will this look like in an actual school setting? So for example, we're looking at an alternative enrollment modalities. So when we say alternative enrollment modalities, we're exploring the possibility of enlisting learners through text messaging, where teachers send text messages to parents. Or we can mobilize education volunteers to do house-to-house listing of learners. And we can also do learner listing, we can develop an application system that will allow a listing of learners. So another is, how will the school facilities and learning materials look like? What changes do we need to do in our school facilities and learning materials? Schools and the other learning learning places are safe and protected spaces for learners. School administrators, communities, and other stakeholders must ensure that schools have adequate facilities to ensure a healthy and conducive learning environment. All schools should prioritize setting up proper water, sanitation, and hygiene facilities and programs including hand washing facilities and regular disinfection facilities. As we have no or very limited hardware or internet connectivity, then our best option is really to resort to printed materials such as textbooks and other supplemental materials. In the technical note, there's a very good highlight there that says printed materials are high-touch surfaces. So therefore, even printed materials, we may need to regularly disinfect using disinfectant wipes or other alternatives. As learners may continue learning at home, learning materials may be provided to be brought to home for self-study, but with clear guidance or instruction from the teacher. Schools may develop self-learning kits as an alternative learning tools that can be used by parents to assist learners at home. Again, I learned these self-learning kits from the technical note. How will school schedules look like? So, learner school attendance shall be divided into 2 shifts. Because we do not have internet connectivity, our best option is still face-to-face interaction. But given social distancing and stay-at-home policies, we have to make it sure that learners come in shifts, in 2 shifts, or in batches. The first batch, or the first 50% of the total school enrollment, will go to school, for example, on Monday and Tuesday, and devote Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday for home-based learning to do assigned tasks or projects. The second batch, or other 50% of total school enrollment, will go to school on Wednesday and Thursday and devote Friday, Monday, and Tuesday for home-based learning to do assigned tasks or projects. On the other hand, teachers will do learning sessions on Fridays to reflect and evaluate teaching and learning delivery for the week and prepare for the following week. Home-based learning activities shall be supported by teachers and or parents and community members who can serve as learning models, monitors, and mentors. Educational radio or TV programs shall be produced and utilized to support home-based learning activities where there is feasible. Class schedules may be adjusted accordingly to consider distance of learners and teachers' homes to school, availability of and social distancing in public transportation, curfew hours, and other restrictive measures being implemented related to COVID-19. Flexible working arrangements may also be done. Classroom management. How do we manage classrooms if we have social distancing? So, social distancing shall be considered in arranging the classroom for teaching and learning interactions and activities. The reduced class size present per class day should allow for more learning space and safe distance between and among learners. Learners should be able to maintain at least 1 seat apart or in a U-shaped arrangement, leaving the center of the classroom open for group activities. Outside of classroom learning sessions may be done should there be a need for more spaces and more interaction in safe distance. When possible, learners should leave shoes and slippers outside the classroom. Classrooms are encouraged to have simple, not costly, and improved hand-washing facility, improvised hand-washing facility coupled with regular hand-washing activity. Learners should be encouraged to wear face masks and practice proper coughing and sneezing etiquette. How will the sessions look like? So if you can see, our learning sessions, the content of our sessions will be a blend of the regular academic content, which is in the K-12 curriculum, but we need to blend this with the COVID-19 context and experiences, as well as themes related to safety and well-being of learners. So, teaching and learning content and delivery shall consider the integration of the regular academic content. At the moment, we are, the national government is in the process of dissecting the national curriculum to two. They are dissecting it to two to identify the most essential competencies and the desirable competencies. So we will focus more on the most essential competencies at the moment. There is a need to identify and integrate lessons or themes that will generate understanding on COVID-19. There is also a need to identify and integrate certain themes that will ensure safety and well-being of all learners, especially those who have vulnerabilities or comorbidities. Teachers should be able to adapt to this new normal in the teaching and learning process. Schools and other learning institutions are encouraged to make necessary adjustments to school norms and behavior, including provision of support and supervision to teachers, delivering the adaptive and teaching learning sessions. Learners shall take an active part in the teaching and learning process and be given more responsibility in completing tasks and projects, as well as in achieving their learning goals. Parents and community leaders and other stakeholders shall have more direct and active part in the teaching and learning process by supporting learners, particularly during home-based learning. Now, what will be the learning delivery modalities? As I said, we need to do face-to-face or classroom-based instructions, and it shall be our main delivery modality, but in a limited sense. But the limited time for classroom-based instruction shall be devoted to engage learners in critical reflections on certain subject or topic or task by doing more research group work, practical work, and classroom discussion. Now, how do we conceive home-based learning? Home-based learning will be a supplemental learning modality where learners do their learning activities at home. Parents will be encouraged to set up a learning space at home or a study area where learners can do their learning activities. Now, this is the main thing. The absence of a teacher in the home-based learning will be compensated with parents who will serve as mentors and guide, community volunteers who will monitor and ensure learners are at home doing their learning activities, a radio program and TV and other instructional guide to help parents and learners do the learning activities at home. I will have to skip some of the modalities, but just to highlight one important thing, we need to also do some measurement of learning outcomes, which we need to, the formative assessment, we see this as something that is more appropriate now because we don't imagine parents doing subject-based sessions with their kids. We expect parents to be doing task-based or project-based sessions. Like, for example, parents can do sessions with their kids on how to do face masks. And on that basis, this will be the basis for assessing the progress, the learning progress of our learners, whether or not they are able to complete certain tasks. When they come back to school, the teachers will have an interaction with them and assess whether how much progress have they made. On teachers and education workers, teachers and other education workers, including parents, are more than ever at the front line of this new mode of education service delivery. So they need to be supported. There is a need to prepare and provide mentoring to teachers and education workers. There is a need to do a support mechanisms from the ministry, from the regional down to the district to the communities. More importantly, and I should say this, we need to repurpose and refocus existing resources to prioritize support to continued education service delivery. Relevant support mechanisms shall be established from the regional to the communities. So I guess that's where I will stop my sharing. But can we go to the next slide? Our ways forward. Can we go to our ways forward is really We need to prepare schools, teachers, parents, communities, and other stakeholders for the big change in the mode of education service delivery. We need to prepare materials as soon as possible that will be needed, such as self-learning kits, and we need to organize team of teachers and other support mechanisms. Just today, the National Secretary of Education announced that we will be opening our classes on August 24. So perhaps what is stressful for education is not COVID-19 itself, but the amount of change that needs to be done immediately for education to adapt to this new normal. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yul. I hope I wasn't rushing you too much there. Such important information for our participants. So thank you so much. Really great to hear about the work being done in your context, and thank you for joining us at clearly very quickly changing times, and an important message to end on there. So we've heard from two very different contexts, and I'm now going to hand over to Marco Grazia, who joins us from World Vision, to share some of his perspective around the COVID-19 response and the INEE minimum standards as he works to support World Vision's response globally and teams working in a whole range of contexts. So over to you, Marco.
Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you everyone for joining today. So yes, if indeed what I'm trying to illustrate in the following 3 slides, so I'll try to be brief. It's how we use the INEE minimum standard in our programmatic guidance for education globally to support almost 75 country offices that we have now in our global response. Therefore, these guidance are necessarily broad because they have to address a variety of contexts and situations across different phases of the crisis. So some of our country offices still are in the preparedness phase. Some others are in an acute phase of the response, and others like China, for example, are in a recovery phase. So our intention was to offer a guiding instrument to connect what we do and what should be done to adapt to the new situation using the INEE minimum standard, but also help our national offices to navigate the vast amount of materials and resources. And I would say that this was a wonderful opportunity also for us to institutionalize the INEE minimum standard. So we on purpose decided not to call this guidance programmatic guidance for education in emergency, again, because we are addressing different contexts, and some of those contexts are definitely fragile contexts or humanitarian contexts, but others are transitioning economies, are contexts where we have only had so far development programs. So we had to address a variety of contexts, and therefore we intentionally decided not to call it guidance for education in emergency, but just guidance for education. So the INEE, we structured the guidance in three levels, basically. One level that outlined how our sector approach for development and for humanitarian context is aligned with INEE minimum standard. So this level basically referred to the INEE minimum standard, but because it's addressed to like our national director, it tried to give practical example of what we can do to address, for example, the issue of access in this new context, how we could ensure, for example, the support to the environment, the protective environment where the learning is happening now. And we also elaborated some advocacy messages that are connected with the INEE minimum standard. For example, looking at the need for supporting and ensuring that the workforce for the education system keep a regular salary and keep on working within the new context. So the second level, it's more like a level where we try to help our field offices to navigate across the vast number of resources and tools. So the INEE Technical Note is referenced there as a guiding document, along with the document that was elaborated at the very beginning of the response by UNICEF, IFRC, and WHO for addressing COVID in schools with different education personnel, teachers, and parents and children. And again, we have also sort of categorized or listed the main repository where our field offices can access resources or tools. And for example, the INEE resource collection, the repository for the global education cluster, the repository that UNHCR has put together. So this is a level of our guidance where our staff get access to the main resources in a way that they can be oriented towards the ones that have the more comprehensive and the most validated resources that are available. The third level, it's the operational level. It's the operational level in the sense that we want to, in this level of the guidance, we are trying to structure our intervention. And in particular, we articulated this level in terms of access, teaching and learning, teachers, but also parents and caregivers, and the education system. So in this level, we basically address how we should change or adapt our program using the approach of categorizing the intervention across the different domain of INEE minimum standard. And this level is also framed within the main foundational domain of and standard of INEE across coordination, needs assessment, analysis, contextualization, and participation. So that our field colleagues have this framing element for adapting their intervention. Can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah. So I would say now, in particular, for dealing with a variety of context. Now, we wanted to give the opportunity to have a tool that helped them to plan across different scenarios. So as I said, some of our offices are in a preparedness phase, others are in a response phase, others are in a recovery phase. So we have the opportunity to with the operational level of our guidance to look at, for example, how we should operate in different modality, using different modality. For example, when we have direct field access, what can we do when schools are still open? Or what can we do when school will reopen? And when we have a partial or remote access, what can we do with other sectors? So we were looking in particular, for example, at access and learning environment domain, standard number 1, looking at the guidance note number 3, for example, for structuring the different element or range of quality education opportunity that we can offer in this specific context. Another important element that I'd like to highlight here is the linear sequencing versus fluctuating scenarios. So in World Vision, we have this fragile context programming approach that is an approach that we use for programming across sector to adapt our program to moving situations that are determined by fragility. And what is important here is that this brought us really to reflect how the INEE minimum standard can be useful to bridge the divide across the humanitarian development context and promote the nexus. So I'm not going into the details of this approach that we have promoted through our guidance, but I would like to give you just an example of how we want to operationalize, for example, some of the minimum standard into a specific pack or menu of activities that can be used off the shelves for immediate adaptation into the context of COVID. So can you please go to the next slide? So we started from one basic consideration. Now, in many cases, in a variety of contexts, learning is now happening at home. Parents have this new role of facilitating the learning, but they are not teachers. So we stress that very clearly in our programmatic guidance. Parents are not expected to be teachers, helping and facilitating the learning, but they are not teachers. And the third element that we were considering when developing this pack was now that education or schools are closed, the protective factor of education is missing. So children cannot be protected through schools. So we developed a pack that has basically two main resources. One is a simple list of 3 shared objectives that have also indicators attached, and a set of activities and resources that are referencing the activities and resources in the INEE collection. And these shared objectives and indicators are really grounded on Access and Learning Standard number 2 of INEE and the Child Protection Minimum Standard number 23 in particular. So we offer this shared objective to be easily adapted in a, for example, in a log frame where we want to promote child protection and education integration in the context of COVID. The second part of the kit, of the pack, it's a home kit for promoting resilience, protection, and learning, and to address the needs of low or no technical resource context. And we created basically a collection of existing resources that are either internal to World Vision or are resourced through the INEE collection resource for structuring activities that can be useful to be delivered at home for different age groups and adapted to the different contexts and ability. And they have and they materialize, let's say, the outputs that are connected with the shared objectives that we have offered in the pack. So this is an example that we use, for example, looking at the teaching and learning domain, in particular standard number 1, 2, and 3, and also looking at the access and learning environment standard number 2. So this is in a nutshell what we did, and it's a living document, our programmatic guidance, so it will be updated regularly, and obviously can be made available externally. So if anyone wants to reach out to me, feel free to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marco. So helpful there, I think, to hear that sort of global perspective, supporting teams across contexts, and a good contrast with the other examples we've heard here today. I'm conscious of time, and we do want a good discussion. So I have seen one of the questions has been asking about how, given the standards don't speak specifically about COVID-19, what steps can be taken to use them, sort of to adapt them, the domains and standards. And actually, my colleague Bente has been working on a blog which will be published soon on just that very topic. So we're just going to ask Bente to just share some final reflections on this question before we start our Q&A. Thanks everyone. Over to you, Bente.
Good afternoon from Norway, everyone. Actually, when we got the first message from our government and governments all over the world, I was thinking, do we have a minimum standard that cover the message they gave? And that was, you have to wash your hands and you have to keep distance. And I was thinking, yeah, we do have that. The INEE minimum standard that cover hand washing and can be directly connected to COVID-19. That is actually domain 2, access and learning environment. And looking at that particular domain and standard number 3, facilities and services. And then we have to remember that the standard, that is the why. It should be qualitative, aspirational, and universal, applicable to any environment. And facility standard 3 under domain 2, that is directly connected to COVID-19. because it is education facilities promote safety and well-being of learners, teachers, and other education personnel, and are linked to health, nutrition, psychosocial, and protection services. So when we look at the key action for that standard, and the key action, that is the what, a suggested action to be taken in order to meet the standards. And that again is about the guidance note. And the guidance note number 6, that is safe water and hygiene promotion. And the guidance note is the how. That covers points of good practice to consider when applying the minimum standards and adapting the key actions of different situations. And of course, safe water and hygiene promotion, that is exactly what we needed after government announced wash your hand. But for instance, thinking about that, that not all communities have water or soap. How can you get clean water and where can you get soaps? Can soaps be produced where you live in your context? How do we make a soap? What is a simple recipe? Do we have all the ingredients to make a soap? Hand washing is a major challenge, but how are other sanitary conditions? So there are many, many issues that we need to consider. Just to be very brief and very quick now, because time is running, I would like to say, to mention that we have developed a matrix where all the minimum standards are attached to a topic that has been important for organizations and agencies during COVID-19. I have taken all the standards, and even each of the standards have several topics. So that will be posted very, very soon. And I hope you can use it. I hope it can be a living document that you can feed into, and you can reach out to INEE and we can just discuss how that can be used. I think that is, that is the most brief I could be. So I'm sorry that time is running, but thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you so much, Bente, and thank you to all our panelists there for rich and varied presentations. We're going to ask all our speakers now to come onto video, and we'll ask Hannah to stop the presentation because we have had many important questions coming in, and we do want to spend some time responding to those. So thank you all. If you could, yeah, great, brilliant. Come on video. And the first question I think is relates to your presentation, Jen, and Natalie as well, you know, with sort of thinking about any additional guidance that can be expected from future versions of the technical note, especially, you know, as we're conscious of, we're in sort of anticipated reopening of schools and so on. So Jen, Natalie, any comments there on what could be expected in terms of future versions of the technical note?
Yeah, I'll take the opportunity to emphasize that we are actively seeking feedback. There's instructions for submitting that feedback in the current version of the technical note via email to the INEE Secretariat. And certainly, I hope it was clear as Jen emphasized that we really did have the acute phase of the response in mind developing this current guidance. Our goal with reaching out to you and using the power of our network will be to speak to other phases of the response in a second version. There's no definitive date on that. Jen, I would pass it to you if you anticipate any specific guidance that you would expect to be included in the recovery phase.
I would like to reiterate that I think the next update of the document will really be kind of as rich as the contributions that come from the community. So we know as Marco and Yul and Teres have shared that we have a lot of diversity, of course, as you would expect, because we're operating across so many different countries. And so I think it will really really build on what comes in from the community, but you can anticipate that there would be some shifting in terms of guidance that would be around a recovery phase. So for, as an example, the document in its current state assumes that students are largely out of school and learning at home, and that parents are the primary learning partners. But as Yul started to outline, we would probably pick up more on what going back to schools in some form would look like. And I know UNICEF and partners have produced a document that starts to get at that.
Great, thanks, Jen. And again, yeah, a reminder of the power of the EIE community and sector more widely. Thanks so much for that. We've had quite a few questions today, but also prior to this around cross-sectoral collaboration. We know that that's really important as we think about the standards. And so, Marco, I wondered if I could just come to you. I know you work across education and child protection, but also thinking more broadly about how we can apply the standards and work with colleagues in other sectors and kind of work across the different standards in different areas.
Yeah, as I said, like, I think the new context really push us towards thinking more through integration. While I was illustrating, for example, what we did in our the example of the pack that we have developed to integrate child protection and education for a home kit. We know that we should be aware that there are demanding factor for parents. They are exposed to stress. They have to look after their own well-being and the well-being of children. So there is a need to really look at the process in an integrated, holistic way, so that we are not just applying education standard because we need to ensure education continuity, but it's more like, how do we support the children in this difficult moment when they are deprived of education, but also protective opportunities. So this is, I believe, one of the key elements that we are looking at in terms of the integration. I would like also to mention that the Alliance and INEE have also launched this advisory group that is looking at the integration across these two different platforms, and it's working in, just launched this month. So it's working for developing a framework or a guidance that can help more broadly, not related to the COVID situation, but more broadly to the integration across these sectors. But as I was saying also in one of the Q&A, there are opportunities even with other sectors, not just with the child protection. For example, one of the questions was about how do we do a rapid needs assessment when we do not have the opportunity to contact. In More Vision, for example, we are looking at how we can start coordinating and integrating our education response with the community health worker, that they do have access to families and children. So again, there are different modality. Another element again would be looking at, and it's not a specific sector, but it's a modality of implementation, looking at cash for education in emergency, which is another element that it's quite important, considering the social safety network that are now activated by most of the government, or at least some of the government, to help the families to recover from the socio-economical impact of the crisis. And so including also education in those intervention, and having the ability to influence those decisions made for tackling the economic impact from an education perspective, it's important as well.
Great, thank you so much, Marco. And Teresa, just Marco mentioned the question around safe rapid assessment at this time, and I know that was posed. I think you might have responded in the chat box, but I just wondered if you could share for everyone some thoughts around recommendations around that, given the restrictions at the moment.
Sure. Thanks very much, Charlotte. So when it came to the rapid assessment that we were able to do, we were very fortunate because the beneficiaries, the children and the youth that we were working with, they were children and youth in our existing programs. So we had a lot of in-depth information and background in relation to who they were, their families, and some of their needs. So our rapid assessment tended to focus rather on the connectivity. So what connectivity they had, how we were going to be able to communicate with them in the event that things become more serious and lockdowns, so that we're not able to visit house to house or tent to tent using social distancing. And also, in addition to that, what kind of support families required. As part of our process, we had already distributed learning at home kits, stationery kits, and also learning at home hard copy materials. So when we were going around doing those distributions, we were able to then discuss just a little bit with parents about what were their concerns and what was it that they were trying to look at. And in response to that, then what we've done is we've developed some guidance sheets that are very simple, one page, that can also be cut up into bulk messaging that we used with parents on things like, you know, how to read with your child at home. Because a lot of parents were saying, well, you know, I'm not very good at reading. I don't have particularly good literacy and numeracy. What can I do? So we sort of looked at some of the concerns, also things like, you know, I'm really stressed and worried about this COVID response. I'm really worried about how this is going to impact on my family. How do I make sure that this doesn't stress my children as well? So trying to look at how do we stay well together? How do we learn well together? So it was very simple and very quick. And really focused on just what our gaps were, rather than trying to look at an extraordinary survey that wasn't really necessary because we had excellent background. So I think, like with all rapid needs assessments that we're going to do, it's really important to keep it quick, keep it simple. Parents have a lot of stresses, particularly when they're displaced, and the last thing that they need is us to be coming up with a whole lot of information that's nice to know, but not necessarily useful at this very moment. We can always go back later and ask later.
Yeah, I think an important reminder and important framing for us there. And maybe I could just ask you to build on that a bit more, because we've had questions about measurement more generally at this time.
Charlotte, you
Sorry, Charlotte.
Sorry, muting myself. But yeah, questions around effective ways of measuring, and also what we should be measuring on this at this time. So just any additional reflections on that.
Okay, I'm happy to give reflections. Don't know that we have the complete answers. At this moment with our team, what we're looking at is we're trying to devise mechanisms for which we're able to capture, you know, not only what children are learning, but in addition to that, the support that's being provided by facilitators and community members and parents in the learning process. To be very honest, part of this priority comes very much from trying to keep our donors informed. We're very fortunate that we have a country director who communicates on a weekly basis with our donors and provides an update and information about what it is that we're doing in very practical terms to help the communities that we're working with during this response. And when it comes to learning, there's been a number of those updates that have showcased education. And so we're trying to make sure that however we're capturing this information is going to be able to tell the story of how all of the people involved in this response have contributed, and hopefully to have not only some quantitative data, but also some qualitative, some stories, some quotes to be able to share. So we haven't got the complete answer at the moment, but we have started from a quantitative perspective. We've started using Mobenzi, online tools where we're getting our teams, our facilitators, when they do go, at the moment, they're able to go house to house, tent to tent, to be able to collect certain information, and sometimes even to be able to use GPS, so that we add that extra layer of evidence that no, we didn't just sit under a tree and say that we visited all these people, but no, we actually went and visited. And there's also the opportunity to take photos to provide additional evidence where consent is provided and where it's acceptable.
Great, thank you so much for that, Therese. And you'll maybe to bring, if your connectivity is still okay, I'm conscious we had to rush you with your comments on measurement. I just wondered if you wanted to jump in here, but I think we might have lost your...
We did, Shar. Sorry, he sent a message.
That's okay. I'm so grateful that we were able to have his presentation. Perhaps then to turn back to all our presenters, I think, you know, we've had several participants reflect on the fact that a lot of the discussions at the moment are focusing on digital solutions which aren't applicable in many EIE settings. And I just wanted to ask more broadly if you feel that you are able to access the information and support you need when it comes to distance learning solutions in these low tech, low resource environments, and if not, what you would like to see from sort of the sector, organisations and networks like INEE, given the challenges in the settings in which you're working. So opening it up to everyone. Any reflections? I don't know if silence is a good thing or a bad thing.
Well,
Charlotte, do you want me to jump in? Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Marco,
no,
please
go ahead.
No, just to say very quickly, I think that it's really fantastic to have the opportunity to have a broad range of examples provided. And I think that that's the one thing that's really good. I know that at the moment we see lots of extraordinary and very creative uses of technology. And I think it's been excellent that INEE has acknowledged and recognized that not everybody has that situation. And so I think that that's something that's also particularly important to be included in the advocacy messaging, particularly when it comes to leadership and also when it comes to donors and other actors in the education sphere, for people to understand that there is that full range and that, you know, technology isn't always going to be the answer. And sometimes it's not only just because there's not the connectivity, but sometimes the permissions that you need to get from authorities, etc., you know, to be able to implement some of these options are not always easy and take a lot of time. And what we need to do is we need to, in this response, is be relevant now, be learning now, not waiting for the perfect response, the perfect mechanism, and then it means that children go without learning for 6 to 8 weeks, maybe longer. So we need children to be learning now, and we need them to be connected, we need them to be protected by that learning, and we do need them to be learning. And it needs to happen now, not in a couple of months' time. It needs to also be something that when we return to learning in a formal school setting or in another setting, that the variety of settings that we use, it needs to be something that can still continue to be relevant even after we return back to classroom environments, rather than being something that just gets put aside and used for games and for other opportunities. It's really important that it's something that can be embraced in the classroom as well.
Yeah, here. Thank you, Therese. Yeah, again, powerful, important messages. Marco, anything to add on your side?
Oh, I just wanted to highlight a couple of things related to technology, and one being that, as Teresa said, technology cannot be the silver bullet, but it's an helpful tool for keep learning. But and there are different modulation of technology, so it's not just online, it's not just an app that can help our children to learn, but there are different ways of using technology, even very simple technology. I do remember, not in the context of COVID, but in the past, we were discussing with colleagues in Niger about how we could improve peer coaching for teachers. And the teachers themselves, they were sharing messages over WhatsApp, and we were thinking about complex systems, but they had already technology in their hand that they were using. So we have also to leverage what is already existing and it's already used by our colleagues on the field. The other consideration that I want to do is that, and I think I put it also in one of the answers to the question that were put in the chat, is that remote learning is important in this phase, but we shouldn't forget that learning happens, and quality learning happens when we interact with people, when we have human contact. That we can't just go back to a new normal that deprives children from human contact. So this is really crucial for me, that quality cannot be just confined into remote learning. It's necessary. It's something that we have to provide in this specific situation due to the circumstances, due to the restriction, but still we have to aim at quality that includes human relationship. Learning through play cannot really happen just in my daughter's room, should happen with the interaction of the children. Sorry,
Thank
this
you,
is
Marco.
maybe a little bit more emotional because I have children in the other room. In the next room, they are crying sometimes because they cannot see their friends. And I think this is really crucial that we keep this high level ambition for the quality of education that we want to deliver. It's not just that we go back to a normal that is reducing the quality of education.
Yeah, again, here. Thank you, Marco. I think powerful words for us to end on here, as I'm afraid to say that we are out of time. I cannot thank our panelists enough. I know there's a lot I'll certainly be taking away from this discussion, and I hope our attendees will as well. Thank you all so much for joining and presenting today. Just a quick note to say this has been recorded and will be shared, and we'll also follow up with any questions that weren't responded to today. We are going to have a break next week from our webinar series as our INEE working group meetings, but we'll then be back the week after. We have a few upcoming webinars focusing on youth, ECD, cross-sectoral collaboration and planning for return to school. So different topics, we'll be sharing details of those in the coming days. Today, I'd just like to say a huge thanks again to the panelists and for everything you've shared. I think, Natalie, you started by saying how the community made you feel hopeful and inspired, and I certainly feel that way leaving today, which in these complex times feel very grateful for. So thanks to all of you, and let's all stay in touch.
Thank you. Thank you.